The Faerienomicon, an account of Faerie, its substance and curiosities, its architectures and landscapes, its hitherto unsubstantiated histories, and the habits of living of the diverse creatures dwelling therein. Assembled by the Keffer family of East Tennessee, under the artistic direction of Miss Ruth Marie Keffer. Published through the auspices of the Poison Pie Publishing House, Knoxville, Tennessee, 2014. The Faerienomicon is an encyclopedia of Faerie rendered in felt. It is organized into 9 sections, each containing 4 entries. Introductions, seasons, dwarves, beasts, fairies, features, dragons, sorrows, and joys. On names. For an elusive place that cannot be geographically assigned to any particular location on a map of this world, Faerie is particularly well known. All peoples have a word for this other world in their native tongue. In some lands it has been associated more with the place one may dwell in the afterlife, while in other lands it is most definitely a place for the living, simply a name for any shifting part of a forest where one becomes lost and encounters strange creatures. The inhabitants of Faerie, the Fae as they are called, also take many shapes, depending upon the land from whence their report emerges. From these accounts, it is said that Faerie is all at once home to a race of diminutive men who prefer to hide from the gaze of mortals, and to fair maidens who wander the woods in isolation and tempt men to their doom, and to pagan gods demoted and banished from civilized lands by the persuasive might of missionaries, and lastly, to beasts of myth who find in Faerie a final refuge from extinction. In this book we shall call this land Faerie, after one species of creature who dwells within, and who has caught the imagination of many of us confined to this more physics-based reality. On Faerie ecology. The ecology of Faerie is no less variegated and abundant than that of Earth, perhaps more so, since it is not bound by those conventions that govern living relationships, symbiotic, parasitic, or predatory, on Earth. Moreover, Earth is only one of the many lands that share a border with Faerie. Having imported biological customs and constraints from multiple worlds, Faerie displays a diversity of locales and specimens therein that are not to be equaled by those of any single land. These other lands include the dreamlands, the realm beyond time and space, pocket universes, hyperdimensions, hyperdementia, and of course, hell. To travel in Faerie, therefore, is to encounter fragments of each of these lands assembled together in a chaotic mosaic that defies conventional attempts to categorize it. If the reader finds the organization of this book to be overly capricious, understand then that such a result was not strictly arrived at by the choice of the authors. On time and space. Throughout the ages of man, thinkers have postulated theories regarding the relationship between Faerie and Earth. The concept of alternate realities is often mentioned. If a theologian is involved in the debate, the specter of relativism likely raises its head. Those adherents to academic approaches cite transcendental perspectivism as the least improbable explanation for the existence of Faerie. In this respect, these thinkers are most like children who accept Faerie as something greater than a figment of one's imagination. The eminent philosophers of Faerie, on the other hand, excuse rather than explain the phenomenon of Earth. Yes, Earth came to be, they admit, and there's nothing to be done about it. This difference in opinions has led to a policy of disengagement between the two lands, and is principally responsible for their distant relations, rather than any constraints that could be encoded in the laws of physics designed to describe distortions in the continuity of time and space. On seasons. The oldest creatures in Faerie are not, in fact, fairies, but rather the seasons, who are ancient and who settled in this land in an age before time was kept. They are all women, or at least all choose to assume the form of women. Amongst themselves they acknowledge that winter is the oldest of them all. The essence of both the similarities and differences between Earth and Faerie are manifest in the seasons. In both lands are the seasons likewise ordered, spring being associated with birth, summer youth, autumn senescence, and winter death. However, in Faerie, seasons are fallible. When they suffer an error in judgment, the repercussions of their mistakes disrupt the entirety of their sphere of influence. Snow may turn to ash, blossoms to sparks of flame, acorns to stone. Falling leaves inflict 1,000 open wounds on the trees thus abandoned. The ever-present vulnerability to these seasonal instabilities engenders in the residents of Faerie a set of ethics which defy contemporary ideals of moral rectitude. On winter. In Faerie, winter is feared not for the chill bite of her icy teeth, but for the dagger at her belt. Red blood on a field of white snow is the heraldry of winter. White flurries above an unmarked field of snow are a sign that winter is currently engaged in a practice of self-abnegation. It is said that winter has a court whose sole aim is to maintain her isolation. The courtiers devise traps that manifest as avalanches and blizzards. They fashion garments woven of pine needles to disguise winter and her forests. They adorn her with circlets and necklaces of the finest, most symmetric snowflakes. In her full regalia, she diffracts sunlight like an icy mirage. Winter is hidden because she holds the much sought-after winter keys of Faerie. Only she knows the true purpose of the keys, but some speculate that they might open the many doors linking disparate facets of Faerie. To peer behind one such door, it is rumored, is to gain an understanding of the ineffable and inscrutable mechanics by which this world operates. On spring. On Earth, spring is a noun, a verb, and an adjective. In Faerie, spring is a pronoun without antecedent, or a preposition without a following clause. Spring, too, is the birth of an object immaculately conceived, hewn in the rough shape of the living from an oblong stone mistaken for an egg. Spring is a rain in the absence of clouds, and a rain in a sky of cotton gray, and the wet greens which follow both. Spring is also the spirit invoked in the Druidic litany, the closing of the way. It is the duty of spring to usher the spirits of the as of yet unincarnated into their corporeal forms. It is no easy task, for the assumption of a new form can be a jarring, even nauseating experience. Spring must massage feeling into the limbs, coo words of comfort, and, under dire circumstances, terminate the delivery. In this role, the preposition spring adopts is until. On summer. Summer claims that she is synonymous with life, though what that means is unclear, since the meaning of life in Faerie, as in other lands, is a matter of circumspect debate. What can be established without doubt is the insatiable appetite of summer for stimulation, which serves to remind her incessantly that, whatever life may be, it goes without notice unless it itches and prompts one to scratch at it. In Faerie, summer assumes a gigantic form, and treads with strides the length of fields across the lands, surveying her domain. Her favorite subjects are not the endless meadows of thistle and sunflowers, nor the flocks of goldfinches that fly whimsically above them. nor the plagues of locusts that sporadically darken their skies. Nor do stately oaks most curry her favor, nor the weeping willow leaning over streams, nor the cherry who have fruited ere the end of May. Loved beyond even these treasures are the fairies, tiny beings who have found such joy in the gardens of summer that they choose not to leave this magic-saturated paradise, preferring instead to spend their time weaving a substance known among them as narcrima, spun from equal parts flax, spider silk, and ether. With this delicate material they repair the petals of flowers damaged by the passing of summer in her enormous guise. Narcrima can also be used to blend frayed heartstrings, splice severed strands of fate, and rejoin threads of time which have, by dint of misfortune, become unraveled. On autumn. Autumn continues to exist despite the request of the other seasons to go away, to find some disconsolate corner of the universe in which it can endlessly cover the land with the fallen brittle leaves from which the trees have sucked all the precious chlorophyll. Autumn is decidedly deciduous and stubbornly clings to the soil in which it has settled, though that land is deemed marginal, full of sinkholes, ravines, streams which vanish without regular replenishment, scars of rock projecting like bone to the dirty skin of the land, unfit for habitation or agriculture. Autumn remains an awkward moment in the silent reprobation of Faerie. Of course, no one actually envisions a year with only 3 seasons, in which summer abruptly transforms to winter without the calm intercession of autumn. Rather, it is an essential component of existence in Faerie to wish for things one does not want, in order to stave off the insatiable hunger for that which one truly longs for but does not receive. On the first dwarf. It is said that the first dwarf wandered out of the mountains into the spring of Faerie on accident. It is also rumored that Spring did not have to resort to threats of violence or promises of delight in order to subjugate the dwarf completely to her will. It is said, though nary a resident of Faerie will admit to believing it, that the dwarf and Spring formed a friendship that blossomed instantly and miraculously, without the aid of manure or any kind of fertilizer whatsoever, without pollination or the agency of any insect, without reason or justification. The dwarf, it is said, simply enjoyed the sight of Spring, having known nothing of the like in the land of his origin, and though he was himself an unpleasant sight, Spring found some unstated redeeming quality in him that prevented her from immediately driving him from her company. On the ice dwarf. Winter, eldest and most privileged of the seasons, insists that her acquisition of a dwarf was contemporaneous with that of Spring, though there are no records that indicate such was the case. To insinuate, however, that Winter briefly abandoned her post in Faerie and traveled to the distant, forbidden lands of the frost giants on the exclusive errand of acquiring an ice dwarf, simply because Spring had recently adopted a dwarf of her own, is not a suggestion to which Winter will gracefully acquiesce. In fact, there are no similarities between this ice dwarf and the mountain dwarf in Spring. The friendship that exists between Spring and her dwarf certainly is not to be found between the ice dwarf and Winter, who stand together among the pines in the snowy silence of the forest and fix each other with inscrutable expressions. On the fire dwarf. In Faerie, some claim that Summer rescued her dwarf from hell itself, where it served as a thrall, fashioning cruel weapons and barbed adornments for the pleasure of greater devils. The veracity of this tale is impossible to establish, since neither Summer nor the fire dwarf will speak of its situation prior to its arrival in Faerie, a condition which is in truth not that unusual for the residents here. Part of the uncertainty lies in the fact that the traits most obviously associated with the difficult past are ones that most of us prefer to keep to ourselves, as revealing such secrets brings both teller and listener neither joy nor relief. It is, however, indisputable that some entity from beyond Faerie sent an Efreet, an elemental being of flame, after the fire dwarf, ostensibly to retrieve him and return him to whatever cage from which he had escaped. The outcome of this pursuit is one that currently remains unresolved. On the Dark Dwarf. Could it have been peer pressure that drove Autumn to claim a dwarf? Would it mar our reputation as unbiased historians to allow the possibility that Autumn was rather driven by an abhorrence for asymmetry? The mind of a season is beyond the faculty of men and women to unravel. Regardless, Autumn sent roots probing down through the subterranean elements of Faerie until she felt a nibble at the tip of a root and reeled through the layers of bedrock and sediment a dark cave dwarf, who, while wrapped in a gauze of fine root hairs from which it could not extricate itself, howled piteously at being exposed for the first time to the unrelenting light of the sun. Let it not be said that Autumn, season of decay, is without mercy, for though she did not release the dwarf, she did allow it to serve her from the shade of shallow caverns. On trees. It is not safe to wander unprepared in the woods of Faerie, and not simply because one may unexpectedly run into one of the seasons in the midst of a tempestuous tantrum, or be suddenly overcome by the shadow of one of their hurricane-sized whims for redecorating the local landscape. Wild beasts roam freely in Faerie, or as freely as anyone can roam, given that all manner of oaths taken, grim fates foretold, curses spat, and benedictions granted bind creatures in Faerie with the unyielding force of iron manacles, to which even beasts of limited sentience are not immune. One commonly thinks of the principal constraint of trees as their roots, binding them to a single spot on the land, but not so in Faerie, where trees occasionally shuffle along and owe instead greater obligation to obey the palate of the season in which they dwell. Spring, most of all, insists on green. Trees, like people, are born with a natural fondness for colors that span the spectrum. Spring's undeviating command of a verdant green can, over decades, perturb trees, causing them to grow irritable, sullen, and at times violent. The nature of the provocation of trees in Faerie is not well understood. Thus wandering in spring woods is ill-advised, especially when the sough of the wind in their boughs carries an ominous overtone. On men of snow. Snowmen are in principle no less capable of acts of kindness than they are acts of abomination. That they are represented as being more closely associated with the latter than the former has an origin in historical anecdotes of Faerie. When Winter introduced the ice dwarf to her court of snowmen, there was much grumbling among her courtiers. There was even a bit of soul-searching among them, although we use the term soul loosely. What have we done wrong, they asked each other, to be pushed aside by this puny specimen? There can be no disguising the fact that in failing to welcome the ice dwarf with any warmth at all, the snowmen acted abominably. However, before we engrave that pejorative on their headstone, let us first momentarily consider how we would have acted in their place, if our own favor with the glory of winter had been called into question. On the Efreet. Too much attention from summer leaves a sensation akin to being scorched by an unrelenting sun in a waterless desert. Indeed, there are places in Faerie where summer dwelt too long, leaving behind only dunes and rocky crags bereft of all vegetation. When the difficulty of its task threatens to overwhelm it, the Efreet comes to these solitary places and replenishes its spirit. While it is true, the fire spirit reflects, that I have not yet returned with the Azer, for that is its word for the fire dwarf, it is not altogether unreasonable to consider my failure to date as a demand for an extension of my stay in Faerie and a continuing reprieve from the boredom of my overseer's station in the smithies of hell. It is dangerous for the Efreet to dwell overlong on this train of thought, for if it allows itself to be consumed by its reluctance to return to hell, it might well abandon the hunt for the fire dwarf entirely, at which point it no longer has any purpose in its existence, and may well vanish instantaneously from Faerie. Such spontaneous disappearances have been known to occur. On the Umberhulk. The soil has a deeper fondness for autumn than for any other season, because autumn returns detritus to the soil, restoring its nutrients, whereas spring and summer only take from the soil, and winter endeavors only to freeze it. That said, one does not hear autumn strutting about Faerie boasting of her intimate friendship with soil, for who brags of being friends with dirt? Those beasts who make their livelihood burrowing beneath the ground, and who treasure dirt as if it were gold transformed to a life-sustaining element, find the silence of autumn on this tender topic to be both disappointing and vaguely unsettling. It is said in Faerie that sinkholes are created by the weeping of these beasts. On the Grass Faerie. About the same time that grasses appeared on earth, the late Cretaceous period, the Grass Faerie sauntered onto the scene in Faerie. At the time, everyone in Faerie was shocked by her outrageous adornments. Public figures declared her monocotyledonous attire scandalous, saying, "Who ever heard of covering your seed with only one leaf?" There were gasps of disbelief when she admitted that her leaf blades had been hardened with microscopic silica phytoliths, which discouraged all manner of creatures from nibbling at her alluring form, and were several times demonstrated to be sharp enough to cut human skin. Nowadays, grasses cover 20% of Earth, and we are rather jaded to the trends deemed so outrageous upon their introduction. In fact, when the Grass Faerie appeared in our yard and invited us to explore Faerie, not a one of us thought to question either her appearance or her motives. We leapt at the opportunity, and, tiny though she was, allowed her to carry us to Faerie, where our education in the ways of the Fae began in earnest. On the Water Faerie. In Faerie, reflections serve as both portals and oracles. Reflections in water, in glass, and burnished metal reveal the viewer in their true form. Ripples caused by a breeze over the surface of water highlight the vagaries of one's virtues. Distortions in the image cast by the curvature in a steel plate suggest the presence of flaws that we overlook in the mental pictures we hold of ourselves. In these reflections, we are transported from our certain footing to an unstable mindset in which the defining characteristics of our person are put to question. When an augury is issued from such a reflection, it is invariably uttered in an echo of our own voice, although we may be so loath to recognize it that we insist otherwise. Both Doorman and Sybil, the Water Faerie is the shepherd of reflections. Both welcomed and feared, loved and despised, the Water Faerie reveals secrets, many of which we would sooner not admit. To claim that the Water Faerie is indiscriminate in the fulfillment of her duties is an absolute error. Her revelations, whether embraced or shunned, are always arrived at in a manner both meticulous and deliberate. On the Mushroom Faerie. Hebeloma crustalliniforme, also known as poison pie, is generally regarded as a toxic mushroom, although there are those who simply describe it as unpalatable. The offending agent in poison pie is hebelomic acid A. In Faerie, hebelomic acid A courses through the arteries and veins of mushroom fairies, delivering its toxin to all cells in the body. The physiological consequences of this cardiovascular anomaly include the abilities 1. To fruit, 2. To blow clouds of spores from one's breath, 3. To soften with the rain, 4. To through a network of tendrils extending beneath the earth, understand the sources of her laments, 5. To soothe her woes through the application of a moist palm, 6. To shade her face from the burning sun in the shadow of a modest cap, and 7. Through the action of decomposition, to provide her the means to bring forth life again, all other misgivings aside. On the Vampiric Faerie. Of the various sorts of undead, vampires and mummies, ghosts and zombies, wraiths and wights, and their ill-favored wanderings through the world of the living, much has been written. Far less has been recorded regarding the presence of undead in the land of Faerie, and for good reason. Faerie exists between life and death, and there undead experience a sort of quasi-undeath, which leaves an uncomfortable sensation in the remains of their guts, if they have them, or in the sac of psychic energy occupying the spot where the stomach would have otherwise sat, if they do not. Zombies that wander erroneously into Faerie return by the quickest means available to the world of the living, or land of the shadow, worse for the wear. Ghosts emerge from Faerie partially solidified, a translucent state between goo and ether for which neither the living nor the dead have any appreciation. Once, a vampire sunk in eternal ennui ventured into Faerie and, for the sport of it, infected a fairy. Of the fate of that vampire, nothing is known. Of the vampiric Faerie thus created, many stories are told. We see her silhouette flying before the lunar orb, but it is unclear to us whether she is chasing invisible prey or fleeing from unseen pursuit. We cry out in the night, "Faerie, Faerie, quite contrary, how does your undeath feel?" The echo of her answer is lost in caverns of darkness. We should like once to have the opportunity to take tea with her in the ruins of her abandoned castle, where she might reveal the nature of her existence in terms that help us make better sense of our own. On birthdays. In Faerie, one is born and reborn on a routine of somewhat irregular basis. One cannot help but engage in a process where losing pieces of oneself while absorbing newly found components in a continuous process of dissolution and aggregation results in a change of individuality on a daily, if not more frequent basis. In such a context, the idea of birthdays, of setting aside a special time to commemorate the arrival of a particular child onto the scene, takes on a markedly different meaning. In one sense, it adopts a cloak of meaninglessness, so common to the residents of Faerie, since it seems rather arbitrary to pick one instant in time as the focal point of the celebration of a process that never stops and is ongoing, especially when the choice is an anomalous point at one extreme that poorly represents the cumulative timeline. At the same time, the stuttering process of improvised adaptation, which others call life, is without question sufficient cause for a jubilee or anniversary gala. In Faerie, like the process itself, the celebration is continuous. Just because one wakes up and finds that child and tells her "Happy Birthday" every day does not diminish the sentiment that one's life took a turn for the better on the day that she appeared and each subsequent day since. On storms. The storms of earth inspire terror with the destructive power of wind, rain, and tides. The storms of Faerie resemble less those of earth than the internal storms of individuals. The squalls that rage within us are no less fierce or capable of inspiring fear than those of earth's climate, but they are less predictable. There are no satellites capable of peering into the human soul and transmitting their information into the waiting headsets of anthropological meteorologists. There are no heavenly maps depicting the slow crawl of massive white spirals toward the coastline. No, the onset of an internal storm is more difficult to perceive, because we are more likely to store up energy beyond sustainable limits, and our response in the face of catastrophic failure is uncertain. Similarly, in Faerie, storms arise seemingly without pretext. Why did the thunder rumble at me today? Be certain that it was not to alleviate a pressure differential in the atmosphere. Why did the floods threaten to wash my home away? It had no origin in the cyclical patterns of oceanic jet streams. Why did a lightning bolt leave a blackened scar down the side of my favorite oak? It was not due to separation of electrical charges within the clouds above. No, indeed, the storms of Faerie come without reason or warning. Unlike the storms within people, after the gale settles and the survivors in Faerie gather, not a one of them is heard to mutter, "Well, I never saw that coming." Because in Faerie, storms are metaphors for the intrinsically ambivalent relationship between universe and man, and thus are wholly natural phenomena. On technology. Because there is an absence of magic in our technological world, we are given to thinking that magic and technology are mutually exclusive. Where one is found, the other must be absent. Such thinking is parochial and in no way different from a chick still inside the egg who, experiencing only darkness and imagining only light, declares that no world could accommodate both. No, the reason that there is so little technology in the magical land of Faerie is not because magic and technology cannot coexist, but rather due to the fact that technology is powered by fossil fuels or uranium and results in pollution so vast and so long-lived that it can change the climate of an entire world and drive species to extinction in unrelenting waves. Moreover, technology requires endless upgrades, resulting in debilitating headaches due to various incompatibilities of versions, adapters of different sizes, and the stubborn refusal of manufacturers to provide replacement parts. In short, the drawbacks of technology are vast. The price of magic, on the other hand, is quite different. A piece of your soul to a minor devil for the gift of flight. A year off the end of your life for an end to unrequited love. A month of grieving in exchange for a child who brings you moments of joy all the days of your life. There is little technology because in Faerie one more easily recognizes uselessness, and having identified it as such, rejects it before exhausting one's reserve of willpower. On music. Travelers associate low flutes and distant bells with Faerie, although this is not the music heard inside the land, but rather just outside its borders. Flutes are a lure guiding the unwitting into a trap. As in all things, the workings of Faerie are capricious if not duplicitous, and the somber clang of bells sounds simultaneously, warning of the dangers of the flute. The first musical instrument of Faerie was the seismic reverberation and the tectonic grinding of earth, and the second, the sough of the wind in the trees, which describes Faerie with a detail outside words, and which, in fact, is the breath of life of Faerie. The two principal characteristics of the music inside Faerie are, first, that precisely the same music is never played twice, and second, that the music cannot be recalled. This elusiveness is not a fault of the listener, but a trait of the music itself, for the music of Faerie eschews idioms and is always improvised in the moment. Evolution has endowed the human brain with physiological pattern recognition capabilities, tools that are useless to characterize and store the information in a music that lacks rhythm, melody, and harmony. The absence or intentional distortion of these characteristics perverts the brain's best efforts to assess this music. Due to the incompatibilities between the structure of the music and the expectations of the brain, the music is either lost or at least not easily retrievable. Therefore, each listening to the music of Faerie is as if one is hearing it for the first time. On the Purple Dragon. The Purple Dragon has never claimed to be a greater entity, to be revered on the basis of some intrinsic lofty status. Its merits rest rather on the demonstrated achievements of its illustrious past. For example, one evening a wicked sorceress traveling through Faerie was waylaid by the purple dragon. She issued a challenge to the dragon. If it could not answer her riddle, then it must allow her to pass unmolested. "Recite to me a sentence," said the sorceress with a cackle, "containing words that rhyme with orange, monster, and purple." The purple dragon ruffled its gargantuan wings and tapped the ground with its razor-sharp talons before replying in a voice that sent ripples through the atmosphere. "The Bornge Honster smurpled me." Then the purple dragon ate the wicked sorceress in a single gulp. On the blue dragon. There is a blue dragon, lodged in a valley of Faerie, who, like many of its kind, suffers from chronic materialism. The acquisition and accumulation of a dragon's hoard has guided its activities across many seasons and over all directions. However, unlike most dragons, this particular blue dragon is a bibliophile, and its hoard takes the form of an immense subterranean library. As a repository of knowledge, human and otherwise, this library has no equal in Faerie, nor in lands with which we are more familiar. The dragon, however, is not inclined to be generous with his wealth. Pilgrims, typically either in dire need or driven by an unrelenting compulsion, brave the hazards of Faerie, and some few arrive at the dragon's door. Their fates are not always known, although it is told that some have been turned away and others have been granted entrance. Of those who have experienced the delights of the library, none have emerged from its labyrinthine aisles of books. Presumably, they have found themselves unable to part with the immeasurable treasures offered within, or perhaps, alternatively, the dragon, in a passing moment of second-guessing his largesse, cornered them in a cubicle and devoured them. On the robotic dragon. Someone, a deranged wizard probably, a dark technomancer, grafted cybernetic implants into a dragon whom he had found crashed to earth and breathing its last. He did not think to ask the dying dragon if it desired a miraculous resurrection through the combination of arcane arts and bionic prosthetics. Nor did he apparently consider the consequences to the villages of the countryside of Faerie when he armed the dragon with artillery laden with the most onerous ordnance. Thus the dragon, once revived, discovered itself equal parts drake and howitzer. Its dragon-scale armor now proved invisible to radar. Its fiery breath was accelerated with napalm. Doubts as to the virtue of constructing such a lethal monstrosity would likely have crossed most of our minds, but if they occurred to the technomancer, he smothered them beneath glorious visions of an airborne armada of draconian might. Not surprisingly, all that remains today of the wizard and his dragon is the dragon, half immortal and remarkably restrained in its acts of destruction, given its undeniable capacity for them. It is sometimes suggested that the dragon refrains from demonstrations of violence as a form of protest against the one who performed the act of reverse euthanasia and who granted it this second measure of life without its consent. On the green dragon. If a traveler in Faerie dares venture into the endless swamps, one will certainly discover, as the sun sets behind the mangroves, that the onset of night is greeted by an amphibious chorus, with tree frogs providing the soprano chirps, bullfrogs the baritone thrum, pig frogs the bass grunts, and various unknown species providing intermittent solos. One is less likely to encounter a green dragon partially submerged in the murky shallows, for these creatures have not sought the solitude of the bog simply to bandy words with every passer-by, no matter how few and far between they may come. There is only one extant record of a conversation with the green dragon, obtained from a wayward pilgrim who was rescued in a state of delirium after being lost in the swamp for centuries. Although the reliability of the source is in doubt, the brief conversation is nevertheless reproduced here. "What are you doing here?" asked the traveler. "Practicing austerities," replied the dragon. "To what end?" "To the only end, to cultivate virtue." "And what does one do with virtue?" "A virtuous soul accumulates merit." "And of what value is such merit?" To this the dragon replied, "When a body expires on earth, its physical substance decomposes and returns to the soil nutrients that allow life to flourish. When a body expires in Faerie, its merit dissipates into the atmosphere, providing the energetic sustenance on which the magic of this realm exclusively relies." On lost children. Fairies are often associated with lost children. In some accounts their role is that of the sinister abductor, snatching the child as it played next to a tree line bounding a pasture behind the house. That child experiences an unchanging lifetime in the stasis of Faerie, returning to the material world only to find 100 or more years have passed. Other stories present fairies in a more fanciful light, as pranksters and tricksters, misplacing objects of sentimental value rather than children. Still other accounts adorn fairies with human virtues, such as the story of the fairy that protected a lost child from a ravenous wolf by spiriting it away to the topmost boughs of a tree, which, when the child was eventually located by its cries for help, required a tall ladder to effect the rescue. Only some of these stories have an origin in fact. It is true that children make good servants in Faerie, and that the distortion of time exaggerates their absence to the external world. It is also a valid point that sentiment endows objects with a powerful magic when brought to Faerie. It is, however, generally not true that fairies express themselves in virtuous ways toward children. Rather, fairies save what little store of virtue they possess to be expended on the elderly, who have succumbed to senility and dementia. For these old folks have known both worlds, Faerie and the other, and have the good grace not to mistake the fairy's aid for anything but what it is, a tender though meaningless measure of reprieve before the end. On illness. Illness and infirmity of the body or mind provide little cause to rejoice in this world. While there are invariably anecdotes recounting the heroic triumph of the human spirit over the adversity presented by a physical ailment or a psychological malaise, such stories serve more to praise the resilience of people than to celebrate the frailty of the body and mind. Such is not the case in Faerie, where disease is highly regarded for its creative powers. Tumors, in particular, once the skin is removed, provide upon meticulous examination objects no less capable than crystal balls of auguring the future of the individual in question. Illnesses of the mind, too, are possessed of an unquenchable creative potential, for they change the perception of the reality of the world around us. Depression, for example, darkens the sky of Faerie. Paranoia enhances the speed and agility of everyone around us, save ourselves. Insomnia turns night into day. Loss of sight grants our opponents invisibility, and deafness robs our enemies of the ability to speak. Dementia is more akin to childbirth than any other biological process. So fecund are the creative faculties of one in its grasp. One might go so far as to say that there is no such thing as illness in Faerie. Nevertheless, it does not take all that much imagination to understand why Faerie has never become a destination for those seeking respite from their ills. On anguish. Anguish, a consuming grief that robs one of the ability to reason, exists in Faerie, but not in the same manner as it is found on earth. In Faerie, Anguish is translucent. Light passes through it, but not without distortion and loss, resulting in a dim, warped image of the original sensation. Tears are holy in Faerie. If tears are captured in crystal vials and mixed with perfumes, they grant cosmic foreknowledge when imbibed. Cosmic foreknowledge is a source of anguish and nothing more. Thus the drinking of such a potion constitutes the act of creating a living, self-perpetuating organism of anguish, which extends grasping pseudopods in all directions like a gigantic seeping amoeba, and absorbs through a process known among scientists as phagocytosis the misery of bystanders, innocent and otherwise. If one stands too close to an amoeba of anguish, however, one risks being suffocated by the amorphous blanketing mass. Therefore, it is only those who are unable to escape suffering through any lesser means that travel to Faerie, seek out such a beast, and hope to have their misery taken from them without sacrificing their life. Should this endeavor indeed end in annihilation, as is typically the case, there is no weeping, for in Faerie one more readily recognizes the reduction of misery as the obverse of joy. On death. The residents of Faerie have difficulty distinguishing between life and death, because they perceive them to be two parts of a much larger process, whose internal boundaries are at best diffuse, perhaps even cyclical, and in some opinions entirely non-existent. To be sure, in Faerie, the geometry of time pushes life in the direction of death, but the transition is continuous and gradual, rather than the abrupt cessation associated with death on earth. There is more than a little death circulating in all residents of Faerie, in some more death than life. This death is found intertwined with life in stone, water, and sky and forest. On moonless nights, a solitary voice cries out among the trees, "I have been dead a long time." Although the birds nesting in the vicinity show no sign of being disturbed by the plaintive call, we understand this declaration as a plea, a heartfelt request for clarification regarding the ambiguous distribution of life and death found within each of us. There is, of course, no answer forthcoming, because the keepers of the secrets, ancient weathered mountains, sunrises on a featureless horizon far out to sea, and evanescent shadows appearing only for an instant in moments of despair, are all mute. In the absence of any explanation, we continue to flicker, alternating in the steps of an erratic dance between darkness and light. The process in Faerie, most akin to the death we know on earth, is to have never lived at all. On possibilities. There is a joy in Faerie, but it is hard for many to recognize. One can only hear it in the raised voices of parents as they shout, "Leave me alone," at the child who has driven them to the end of their patience, with an obstinate refusal to relinquish his demands that all aspects of the world be better sculpted to his young tastes. To be sure, this is the same child for whose provision they have devoted their lives since the day of his arrival. For this child, there exists a shoebox full of photographs in the basement, capturing a history of tenderness not obvious in this instant. The joy of Faerie is deep with age and scarred by vicious acts motivated only by a finite reserve of energy, a failure to live up to one's ideals, a surrender to weaknesses without redemptive merit. In the lands of Faerie, that boy has run away. You can imagine he is hiding behind the bushes just out of sight. That momentary blur at the corner of your eyes, which upon closer inspection reveals only a quiescent shadow, is certainly your joy. You open your mouth to call out to it, asking it to return, but the words do not come because, should your plea go unanswered, even the possibility of your joy is extinguished. In Faerie, possibilities are the constitutive fabric of reality. On processes. The inhabitants of Faerie understand that a journey and a destination are two entirely separate entities, connected only by the happenstance that the latter follows the former. In Faerie, one follows woodland paths of dirt and stone, passing through arches of forested color. If the traveler even entertains the notion of a particular destination, it is subject to change, not only due to the whims of the traveler, but the convoluted vagaries of the paths themselves, delivering one to unexpected locales or simply prolonging the passage in an ever-evolving labyrinth that as likely as not ejects one back at one's starting point. Losing one's way is therefore an opportunity to arrive at an unexpected place, a defiant, if unintentional parry, struck in the cause of spontaneity, a defeat of the powers promoting predetermined rituals and routines. In short, a cause for celebration. Oh, I have been celebrating a long time, decades in fact. My friends in Faerie will vouchsafe this passage. On family. In Earth's universe, the progress of time is measured in processes governed by the unyielding laws of physics. Stars expire, some gently, some violently. Celestial bodies collide, shattering each other into stone shards, or pass only near enough to perturb sufficiently an orbit, which sends a planet careening into the cold depths of interstellar space. Between these events in the annals of cosmic history, biological organisms write their own stories in intricate webs formed by strands of DNA that link generations and contain the secrets of every family's destiny. As such, it is virtually impossible to gaze up at the stars and read our individual fates, though many have tried. In Faerie, this unequal footing between the physical and the biological is reversed. Families of fairies emerge from arboreal homes at night and from a glade examine the stellar messages scrawled in the ether. When they don't like what they see, as frequently occurs, they gather each a lantern and bear it aloft on gossamer wings. There, for the entertainment of those who remain below, the lights of the stars and those of the fairies become intermingled and indistinguishable. As simple as that, the message is changed, destinies altered. You, who saw I was vulnerable, gathered together and rewrote a destiny in which, protected from the dark, I lost my fear and discovered my family, revealed for who they are. On uncertainty. Physicists have quantified uncertainty into a principle bearing the name of one of their heroes. Mathematicians describe the propagation of uncertainty with rigorously derived formula. Denizens of Faerie, through subtle and rhythmic manipulations of their fingers, extract joy from the great milky udders of uncertainty. Having drunk deeply of that nectar, one loses all sense of certainty, even of oneself. Finding oneself surrounded by Faerie, one mistakenly assumes that the self too is a manifestation of the landscape, a natural expression of a world that shifts and hiccups unpredictably. There is no terror in losing oneself, in confusing the merit of virtue with the arbitrariness of circumstance, in becoming an observer of one's own actions from whom the rationale has been entirely obscured. I walked in Faerie with my wife beside me and my children in tow, and I no longer remembered that I had once been plagued by questions such as, "What am I doing here? Why do I love this woman? What are my hopes for my children?" In their place, I understood that we were entities following ballistic trajectories. There could be no doubt that we moved and interacted with each other, but I could not fathom why, and this infectious lack of understanding filled my family and I with a buoyancy that carried us above the treetops, where we surveyed the lands of Faerie and pointed delightedly at the incomprehensible features of the life-sized map. The End. This book is dedicated to Hans Reichel, inventor and experimental musician, who created the ideal soundtrack for the reading of this book in his daxophone operettas. All finger puppets were designed and created by Ruth, Joseph, Lynn, and David Keffer from February 2013 to February 2014. All photographs by David Keffer in East Tennessee from 2012 to 2014. All text by David Keffer and Henry Gorton in 2013 and 2014. Unnecessarily detailed information on the photographs in the Faerienomicon can be found at poisonpie.com. The Faerienomicon is presented in this electronic format free of charge. For those readers who would like to hold a paper copy in their hands or give a gift of the book, a paperback version of the Faerienomicon can be purchased in the shop of the Poison Pie Publishing House. This has been a production of the Poison Pie Publishing House. www.poisonpie.com